So, sorry it's been a while since I've made a video. I've been kind of working pretty heavily on my senior thesis, so that's been taking up a lot of my time. But I'm back, and we're going to be going through part 2 of my Introduction to Metaphysics series. Now, what we covered in the first part was basically the fundamental meaning of metaphysics itself, and this has to do with the study of being as such, being qua being. So it's important, I think, in this part to dive in and get at the heart of what is precisely meant by being, which will provide with us the key to this whole subject matter. Now, Clarke, as I mentioned, Norris Clarke, the central Thomistic philosopher that we're sort of getting a lot of this information from, he gives an all-encompassing definition for the term as it is relevant to its existential usage, which is to say, its characteristically metaphysical usage, that which is. That which is, being the definition of being, is divided into two fundamental, irreducible aspects. The actual existence, namely the is, and the that which is the subject of existence. These two irreducible aspects apply universally to all things real. For in every case, we're invariably speaking of, on the one hand, the existing subject, and on the other hand, the actual existence of that subject. These are not the same. St. Thomas's philosophy, I think, really challenges us to focus on the latter of these two, namely the actual existence, as a window into the heart of metaphysics. So, why is existence so important for St. Thomas? I would argue that it's the hallmark of metaphysics. Now that's because there is a radicality about it. By radical, of course, I don't mean in the political sense of the term, but in the sense of roots. There's an ultimacy about existence that serves as the very edge, if you will, of intelligibility. In other words, beyond existence is not simply a degenerated manner of being, but is simply non-being, full stop. Thus, the very being of things, the actual existence, is the most fundamental aspect of the real. Not only that, but it's universally all-encompassing. In order to speak of this or that, no matter what the subject we're talking about, the being or the existence of the subject is always invariably going to be presupposed, and yet in itself it's going to remain indeterminate with respect to any particular subject that may or may not exist. This is the heart of the distinction between essence and existence in St. Thomas, which is very central to his whole philosophical system. Existence, however, is going to be the more fundamental of these two hemispheres of reality, as it were, because it's, absolutely speaking, universal, all-encompassing, and in and of itself is not determined by any particular essence that may or may not exist. Because existence is so all-encompassing and universal, it is the door through which we enter for metaphysical truth of any kind. Now, as said in the introduction, metaphysics is about integrating the truths of our experience into a meaningful synoptic vision of the whole of reality. So if we're going to truly discern the truth of reality at its deepest level, we have to enter through the door of existence, or of being. Now, if we understand being as that which is, outside of which is that which is not, how do we reconcile the reality of change with this? You may not immediately see the problem here. I mean, isn't it just an obvious fact of our existence? Well, this is why the metaphysician has an important role in the intellectual life, because what he does is he takes the truths that we simply take for granted and don't bother questioning, and puts them, and in so doing reveals deeper, underlying truths that can only be unmasked if we take these obvious, commonsensical truths and dissect them abstractly. So why would change be mysterious in light of what we're talking about? Well, what is change? We can talk about all sorts of instances of change. We can talk about all sorts of changing things. But at the end of the day, if one thinks about it, change as such is in a certain sense irreducible, insofar as you can never get at the essence of what change is simply by pointing out certain instances of it. The intelligible meaning of change is always going to be presupposed prior to pointing at any particular instance of change. So what is it exactly? Inevitably, I think in defining it, you're going to have to conclude that in change, what is not yet becomes so. So there's an outcome that's not yet realized, and what is not a future outcome. Now, how can this be if being is that which is, outside of which is what is not? If this outcome is outside of that which is, surely it would have to be reduced to non-being, which has no ontological status whatsoever. Now, this is where I'm going to introduce one of the key metaphysical principles in Thomistic philosophy, and that's why I started talking about change. And that's the distinction between being in act and being in potency. In order to avoid the absurdity of non-being emerging into being, it makes more sense to conceive of change as a shift from one type of being to another type of being. St. Thomas divides being into two kinds, following Aristotle, and that is actual being and potential being. Actual being is being that is realized, and potential being, or potency, is being as realizable, or the capacity to receive the status of actual being. Change is thus the reduction of realizable being to realized actual being, and both are grounded in reality and must be so in order to account both for the reality of being and for the obvious fact of change in our experience. Actual being, therefore, is limited by potential being, because actual being is only actual in what is realized, but not in what is only realizable. Cold water, for example, is actually cold, but only potentially hot. Hotness is realizable in the water, but is not actually realized, and is thus limited to our particular mode of actuality, at the exclusion of other realizable receptive capacities of being, or potencies. Now, potency, thus, puts a limit on act, and restricts it to this or that mode of actuality. With this said, though, there's nevertheless a difficulty. How is it that realizable being and realized being can both enjoy equal status of being real? Is not that which is squarely within what is actually realized? How does it make sense to say that potential being actually has reality if it's not actual? I think this is a good way to show the real value of metaphysics and how this isn't just a pie-in-the-sky abstraction, because this distinction between actuality and potentiality, or act and potency, when you really reflect on the implications of this distinction, actually serves as the basis for how we can come to know the very existence of God. For if actual being is that which is, outside of which is what is not, then in order for potential being to be real, it would have to be grounded in actual being, or actuality. But in order for this to be the case, what is actual would have to be at the same time realized, yet also realize what is only realizable, which is absurd. As St. Thomas says, a thing cannot be both an act and potency at the same time and in the same respect. So, what can realize potency if not actuality that is limited by potency? What if there was a third option in this equation? Let's put it in the form of a syllogism. Premise 1. Actual being is that which is, outside of which is what is not. Premise 2. If there is only limited actuality, then that which limits it, potential being, can only be non-being, since that which is absolutely speaking outside of actual being is that which is not. Premise 3. Potential being is not non-being. It's a real feature of the world. It's a real aspect of reality. So premise 4, therefore, there has to be unlimited actuality, which can ground both the reality of limited actual being and potential being, and this is what we would call God. Now, this has to be the case because if there is only limited actuality, then that which limits it would be outside of the sphere of actuality, and therefore would be reduced to non-being. So the reductio ad absurdum is on the supposition that all you have is limited act and potency. But so since actual being is the source of a thing's very presence in reality, if there is a principle that limits it, and thus is really distinct from it, namely potency, then either it is outside of actual being, absolutely speaking, or only outside limited actual being, whereby limited actual being and potency both derive their reality from pure, unlimited actuality itself, which is what we mean by the essence of God. Thus, there can be change and distinction in the world, which are both instances of act and potency, change being a shift from potency to act, and distinction being being limitations of actuality into distinct finite essences, which is what we'll get to later. Because you still have perfectly preserved the primacy and indivisibility of being as such, which you talked about in the beginning, which grounds divisible and changeable being in the infinite vastness of its embrace. There is no potency that is not fully grounded in actuality, because pure actuality is not limited by potency. Only limited actuality is limited by potency. Thus, the primacy, indivisibility of being as such is kept intact whilst accounting for the reality of change, divisibility, and multiplicity in our direct experience. This is just one example of how carefully thinking through a simple, taken for granted banality of change, for example, can drive the mind into the depths of reality where God is awaiting to be discovered. I hope this was a helpful sort of unpacking of act and potency as such and how it relates to the existence of God. You may see this as related to St. Thomas's first way of proving God's existence, and indeed it is. My approach, however, kind of focuses on the distinction between act and potency purely in and of themselves, because I think it helps to understand what they are, and that simply in and of themselves they can lead to the existence of God. Now, in the next video, we will continue to discuss act and potency, but as it relates to the topic of essence, or what it means to be a thing, or an individuated being, or a subject in the first place, which will then lead us to refuting nominalism in favor of realism, which is something that I'm very passionate about and see as vital to Christianity, and even a sensible political outlook as well. So I hope you'll stick around for that. If you have any questions, if things were unclear in this video, you can comment them below. I will either respond to them in the comment section or integrate them into the next video. If this has been helpful, you can like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.